So welcome to this evening's devotion. So my purpose is to keep it less than an hour. And then Dr. Kedida tells me we have another group joining us tomorrow, today evening, essentially. So we'll move like to that part of the study tomorrow. So today, for now, what I want us to handle is very basic as a devotion. So before we start, I'd like us to have a silent prayer. Amen. So I'd like us to start from the book of Romans chapter 1. And I specifically want us to handle Romans chapter 1 verse 14 to 16. So I'll start from verse 14. Paul writes, I am a debtor put to the Greeks and both to the Greeks and to the barbarians. It's okay. We'll give Dr. Kedida some minutes to get to Romans chapter 1 verse 14. Thank you.
And Saba Udrumafu Warra Grikota.
So Paul writes, I'm a debtor put to the Greeks and to the barbarians.
Ani Saba Udrumafu Warra Grikota, Warra Grikotan Tainifis.
Both to the wise and to the unwise.
Warra Bektutaf, Warra Wallalotafis.
Verse 15, Paul writes, so as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also.
Kanaf anisin warra Roma jiratanitmo wangela lallabudaf himmamada.
For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. That is verse 16.
And wangelat in yellow.
For it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek.
In Numna Wakayo is our Amantika Munduma Durandurse, Warra Yudota, Akasmas, Warra Grikota, Fayisuda.
Alright, so with that in mind, I want us to go back to verse 14. So if you read verse 14, which principle are we able to see in verse 14? Which principle is Paul using in writing verse 14? So in verse 14, I'll give you some clues. Paul starts saying, I am a debtor. So he has some debt, and this debt is put to the Greeks and to the barbarians. So he expands us and tells us, put to the wise and the unwise. So Ebenezer, what is the principle in verse 14? You are in Gimbi, so I believe you should be familiar with this.
Is it repeat and enlarge?
Repeat and enlarge. So what I'd like us to do when we are going to study, as far as we are going to learn the truth, I'll also be endeavoring to show the methodology that we use to learn the truth.
dhugaa beekuuf methodology yookaan akkaataa qorannaa kitaaba qulqulluu itti fayyadamnu akka beeknu barbaada.
So my first endeavor will be showing the methodology.
Yaaliin kun ni jalqabaa gaa methodology kana yookaan qorannaa kitaaba qulqulluudhaaf tooftaa kana.
And then the next endeavor is for us to learn the truth. Both of them I believe are important.
Jalqaba methodology yookaan tooftaa qorannoo achi booda immoo dhugaa nu barbaachisu gara beekutti deemna.
So if we go to verse 14,
yoo gara lakkoofsa 14 dhanne,
Paul says is a debtor to both. One is a debtor to the wise.
Gatiitu narra jira jedha warra ogeessotaaf.
Is also a debtor to the unwise.
Warra ogeessota hin taaneefis jedha.
So Paul will go to the next part of that sentence and repeat and enlarge. So repeat and enlarge, I want to explain what this is about.
Yeroo hima sattaanutti deemu wantuma sila jedhee irra deebi'ee bal'isee kaasa.
So if I say and say one,
yoon tokko jedhe,
and the next time I say 1, 2,
isa lammaffaa irratti immoo tokko lama yoon jedhe,
so what I've done is I've repeated but I've enlarged.
Isa lammaffaa irratti isuma sanan irra deebi'ee garuu nan bal'ise.
So repeat and enlarge is you repeating the same information and adding some extra information.
Repeat and enlarge keessatti odeeffannoo masa silaa irra deebina garuu odeeffannoo dabalataa mu kenna.
So what I've basically done is that I've repeated and I've enlarged.
Isa silaas jalqaba dubbanne irra deebina ittis immoo daballee bal'isnaa.
I've given the same information but I've supplied some extra information.
Odeeffannoo isuma silaa kennina garuu immoo odeeffannoo dabalataas kennina.
So that is what we call repeat and enlarge. Is a very important principle when we are studying the Bible.
Yeroo kitaaba qulqulluu qorannutti repeat and enlarge yookaan irra deebi'anii bal'isuun kuni qajeelfama baay'ee barbaada.
So Paul in verse 14 is a debtor to both the wise and the unwise.
Lakkoofsa 14 keessatti gaa Phaawulos ani gatiitu narra jira warra ogeessotaaf warra ogeessota hin taane jedha.
Okay, it was wrong. That is not what he says. Apologies. Okay, it's correct, but not exactly what the verse. So the verse starts by saying, I'm a debtor to both the Greeks and the barbarians.
Jalqaba warra Giriikiitiif achis warra Giriikota hin taaneef jedha.
So Paul is a debtor to both the Greeks and the barbarians.
Giriikotaa fi warra Giriikota hin taane.
So the second part of that sentence, enlarged and saying, is a debtor to both the wise and the unwise.
Kutaan lammaffaa hima sanaa warra ogeessotaa fi warra ogeessota hin taaneef.
So by repeating and enlarging, we are able to understand that the Greeks are the wise.
Qajeelfama irra deebi'anii bal'isuu jedhuun egaa Giriik jechuun warra ogeessota jechuudha.
The barbarians are the unwise.
Warri Giriikota hin taane immoo warra ogeessota hin taane jechuudha.
So Paul is a debtor to both the so-called wise and the unwise.
Kanaaf Phaawulos gatiin narra jira warra ogeessotaaf warra ogeessota hin taaneef.
So if we go to verse 15,
gara lakkoofsa 15 yoo dhannu,
verse 15 says, so as much as is me, I'm ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also.
Kanaaf ani isin warra Roomaa jiraatanitti immoo wangeela lallabuudhaaf dhimmamaa jedha.
So so the debt that Paul has to both the wise and the unwise.
Gatiin Phaawulos jedhu warra ogeessota hin taaneef.
Verse 15 gives us an answer.
Lakkoofsa 15 deebii isaa nuu kenna.
So what is this debt?
Gatiin kun maalidha?
What is her name?
Maqaan keenya Galaanii.
That is a hard one. Is there another name?
For her or?
Yeah, for her. I don't want to. All right. So if you go to verse 15, I'll survive like that. If you go to verse 15. All right. Let's start from verse 14. So Paul is a debtor to both the Greeks and the barbarians. But we know the Greeks are the wise. The barbarians are the unwise. So verse 15 is going to tell us the debt that Paul has to both the wise and the unwise.
Lakkoofsi 15 egaa liqii yookaan gatii warra ogeessotaa
So if you go to verse 15, it answers the debt that Paul owes them. Is a debtor.
Paulos liqiin irra jira jedhu sanaaf deebii kenna.
So what is this debt? Is it money? Or what is this debt that Paul owes them?
Gatiin narra jira ne jedhu kuni maallaqaa jedhu. Gatiin isarra jiru maali? Gatiin isarra jiru. Lakkoofsa 15 irra jira deebiin isaa.
I'm saying the answer is in verse 15.
Deebiin isaa lakkoofsa 15 irra jira. Ifaadhamni deebiin isaa lakkoofsa 15 irra maal?
So can you see the debt that Paul owes them in verse 15?
Liqii isarra jiru sana argaa jirtu lakkoofsa 15 keessatti.
Okay. Let them read verse 15 in the local language. You'll translate to me.
Yeah,
maybe it
they already they know it. They got it.
Oh, they know it. So what is the debt?
Man, the king of the because of preaching the gospel.
The gospel. So the debt that Paul owes to both the debt that Paul owes to both the wise and the unwise is the gospel. So you will see that in verse 15. So if now we move to, so if you remain in verse 15, so what you are able to see in verse 15 is that this gospel has two classes. Because we have the gospel, we have a debt which is the gospel, and this gospel belongs to the wise one. Second, it belongs to the unwise. So those are two classes. So what that tells us about the book of Romans, Paul is not dealing about countries. So Paul is dealing with two classes of worshippers. And I know that is a characteristic we already know it's associated with the gospel. So another thing we can learn from that is that the gospel that produces two classes of worshippers, we have a specific word we call it. So what is the gospel that produces two classes of worshippers?
Everlasting gospel.
It's an everlasting gospel. So in Romans chapter 1, we are not just dealing with the gospel, but we are dealing with an everlasting gospel. Because these are gospel that has two classes of worshippers. So I want us to move to verse 16. So Paul writes, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, also to the Greek. So Paul continues and tells us he's not ashamed of the gospel. So why is Paul not ashamed of the gospel?
Power of God.
Because the gospel saves. Verse 16 says the everlasting gospel is the power of God unto salvation. So the reason why Paul is not ashamed of the gospel is because it's the gospel that saves. That gospel has power to save. Is that making sense? And then he continues and says, this gospel belongs to who? According to verse 16. What does the gospel belong to in verse 16?
For the Greeks and for the
You guys are geniuses. So the gospel belongs to the Jews first and then to the Greeks. So this the gospel in verse 16 is the gospel in verse 15. In relation to the gospel in verse 15, Paul was a debtor. So when you come to verse 16, Paul is a debtor to who and who? So Paul is a debtor to the Jews and then to the Greeks. Are we seeing that? So verse 16 is a repeat and enlarge of verse 14. So the Greeks in verse 14 are the wise in the same verse 14. But when you come to verse 16, they are the Jews. So the barbarians in verse 14 are the wise, are the Greeks. So it's repeat and enlarge. So we come and ask ourselves a question. How can the Greeks in verse 14 be the wise? But in verse 16 they become the unwise. How can that be possible? So we go back to verse 15. Verse 15, Paul is a debtor of the gospel to a specific class of people. But this class of people says they are in Rome. So the location of these Greeks and barbarians in verse 14 is that they are in Rome. So these are the wise and wise in a country called, or a nation called Rome. And that is where the geographical model now assists us.
Modern in geography.
So now when you come to verse 16, now we are not dealing about countries. We are dealing about nations. So we have the Jews, the Jewish nation, and the Greek nation. So the wise and unwise in this context of verse 14, they are in Rome. Their location is in Rome. In verse 16, we are dealing about nation. That is why it puts the word everyone. So according to, in verse 15, everyone equals to the Jews and Greeks. That is everyone according to the time Paul is living. So they belong in this context, and everyone else who was not a Jew, how did we call them in ancient history? They were Gentiles. So everyone else who was not a Jew was a Gentile. So that is the context of verse 16. The Jews were considered wise. The Gentiles were considered unwise. So if we summarize what those verses will tell us, is that Greeks
Warri Giriikonni
are the same as wise,
ogeessota
are the same as Jews.
akkasumas immoo Yihuudoota warra jedhaman.
Barbarians
Warri Giriikii hin taane immoo
will be the same as unwise.
warra ogeessota hin taanedha.
Then they will be the same as the Greek.
Warra Giriikotadha.
Two classes of worshippers.
Waaqeffattoota kutaa lama.
So that will be the first class,
Warra gartuu tokkoffaa fi
and that will be the second class.
warri kun immoo gartuu lammaffaadha.
Can we all like see that? Can we see that repeat and enlarge?
Irra deebi'anii bal'isanii ibsuu kana walirra.
Now, if we go to, if I ask another question,
Gaaffii kan biraa isin gaafadhe.
now where do we see, if we prove text, where do we see these same characteristics in the Bible?
Yoo proof text fayyadamne kitaaba qulqulluu keessatti amala kana eessatti argina kutaa kan biraa.
I mean, where we have the everlasting gospel,
Wangeela bara baraa.
and then the everlasting gospel is going to produce two classes of worshippers.
Wangeelli bara baraa kun waaqeffattoota kutaa lama kan inni.
And this everlasting gospel belongs to everyone.
Wangeelli bara baraa kun kan nama hundumaa.
Remember, everyone in this context, in the context of Romans chapter 1, is just Jews and Greeks.
Akkaataa Roomee boqonnaa tokkotti nama hundumaa kan jennu Yihuudootaa fi Giriikota.
So where do we see these same characteristics in the Bible? Another verse in the Bible that gives us this.
Kitaaba qulqulluu keessatti lakkoofsi kan biraan kan waan kana nuu kennu jira. Waaqeffattoota kutaa lamaa kan gartuu lamaa kan nuuf kennu jira.
Revelation 14.
Mul'ata boqonnaa 14.
So I want us to go to Revelation 14,
Mul'ata boqonnaa 14 gaafa dhannu
verse 6.
lakkoofsa 6.
And I'm saying Romans chapter 1 verse 14 through 16 is the same as Revelation chapter 14 verse 6.
Roomee boqonnaa tokko lakkoofsi 14 mul'ata boqonnaa 14 lakkoofsa 6 wajjin tokkumadha.
So verse 6 reads,
lakkoofsa 6 akkas jedha.
and I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven,
Kana booddee ergamaa biraa tokko wangeela isa bara baraa qabatee warra lafarra jiraataniif.
having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, to every nation and kindred and tongue and people.
Kana booddee ergamaan biraa tokko wangeela isa bara baraa qabatee warra lafarra ta'anitti saba hundumaatti, gosa hundumaatti, afaan dubbatamu hundumaatti, nama hundumaattis lallabuudhaaf bantii waaqaa walakkaa otoo balali'uu nan arge.
So if we come to Revelation chapter 14 verse 6,
Yoo gara lakkoofsa 4 dhufne
one characteristic we can see is that this gospel belongs to everyone.
Amalli tokko as keessatti arginu wangeelli kuni nama hundumaatiif.
Because it's to everyone on earth, nation, kindred, tongue and people. So that is everyone in that context.
Saba gosa afaan hundumaa gaafa jennu nama hundumaa.
So the only thing that changes is that the scale has increased.
Wanti adda ta'e asirratti wantichi bal'atee iddoo hundumaa haguuguu isaati.
So scalability is one of the characteristics of parables.
Ayuntaaf afaan Oromoo for scalability. Scalability
Scale, like the scale differs.
Sadarkaa isaa skeelii isaa ol kaasuuf kaasu.
For example, if we go to the parable of the lost sheep,
Gara fakkeenya hoolaa badee oolan fakkeenyaaf
a sheep can represent this world that was lost.
hoolaan addunyaa kana bakka bu'uu dandeessi addunyaa ishee badde kana.
A sheep can represent the church of God.
Hoolaan waldaa waaqayyoo bakka bu'uu dandeessi.
Or the sheep can represent an individual sinner.
Cubbamaa tokkos bakka bu'uu dandeessi jechuudha hoolaan.
So what you are seeing is that it's one parable that can be understood in different scales.
Fakkeenyuma tokkotu sadarkaa adda addaatti hubatamaa jechuudha.
So this is the same thing here in the context, in the time that Paul is living, everyone is just Jews and Greeks.
Yeroo Phaawulos jiraachaa ture namni hundumtu bakka lamatti kan inni qoodamee jiru Yihuudootaa fi Yihuudoota warra hin taane yookaan Oromoota warra jedhaman kana.
When you come to Revelation chapter 14 verse 6, everyone, now the scale increases.
Sadarkaan isaa hin guddata gara mul'ata boqonnaa 14 lakkoofsa 6tti gaafa dhufu.
So if we can pick the parties we are seeing in Revelation chapter 14 verse 6,
Mul'ata boqonnaa 14 lakkoofsa 6 irra kan jiru kana fudhannee
we have an angel.
ergamaan jira.
That angel is carrying an everlasting gospel.
Ergamaan kun wangeela bara baraati kan inni baatee jiru.
So we have an angel carrying the everlasting gospel.
Wangeela bara baraa baatee jira.
But that everlasting gospel
Wangeela bara baraa kun
is being carried to all the people on earth.
namoota lafarra jiraatan hundumaatiif kan inni dubbatamu barsiifamu.
Okay, so those are the characteristics, those are the parties we can pick in Revelation chapter 14.
Mul'ata boqonnaa 14 keessatti amalli nuyi arginu warra kanadha.
So if we come to the Bible, our basic knowledge, we know an angel is a messenger.
Kitaaba qulqulluu yeroo hubannutti ergamaa jechuun namuma hojii wangeelaa hojjetu ergame jechuudha.
So if an angel is a messenger, they have to have a message.
Ergamaa kan jennu kun nama ergame yoo ta'e namni ergame immoo maal qaba? Ergaa qaba.
So and a message in this context is the everlasting gospel.
Ergaan kun immoo galma kana keessatti wangeela bara baraa.
So what does everlasting mean in this context?
Bara baraa jechuun maal jechuudha galma kana keessatti? Bara baraan kun maal agarsiisa?
Everlasting. No, I'm not asking about everlasting gospel, but the word everlasting. What does that mean in that context?
It's saying an unlimited time.
Eternal.
Eternal.
So a better word to use is eternal. Unlimited time is eternal. So what that tells us, if it's eternal, is that the everlasting gospel has always been there. It's not a new thing. Because it's an eternal message. And this, if we go back to the book of Romans chapter 1, it's the gospel that saves. So it has always been there eternally to save humanity. So let's see if that is true. So I want us to go to Selected Messages, book 2, page 106, paragraph 2. And see what Ellen White is writing.
Ellen White,
you open for Appellate translation? I just read you translated. The message proclaimed by the angel flying in the midst of heaven is the everlasting gospel. So which verse is Ellen White quoting in Selected Messages, book 2?
Revelation 14.
Revelation chapter 14. Can we see that? And it says, the same gospel that was declared in Eden when God said to the serpent, I'll put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel.
Sifi na intigidu sanyike fi sanyise gidu inni matakera nijita atimo komesa inidita kanjo.
So which verse is that Ellen White is quoting?
La cosa sakamda kan Ellen White sirtora abdertu.
Genesis chapter 3 verse 15. So therefore what Ellen White is saying, is saying Revelation chapter 14 verse 6 is the same as Genesis chapter 3 verse 15. So which principle is that? That is not repeat and enlarge per se. Compare and contrast. So she's comparing Revelation chapter 14 verse 6 and saying Revelation chapter 14 verse 6 is the same as Genesis chapter 3 verse 15. So that is compare and contrast. So we learned this principle principle for those of us who are in Gimbi.
Warri gimbii turtan qajeelfama kana waliin baranneerra.
We said if you bring two things together,
Wallame wal bira finne
what have you just done?
maal godhaa jirra?
Just a position. So if you bring two things together, right, let's give a practical example.
Fakkeenya qabatamaan sii kenna.
So if I bring this marker pen
Maarkarii kana yoo fudhanne
and bring it together to the other one,
wal bira qabnee isaa tokko wajjin
up to that point what I've done is just a position, the act of bringing two things together.
yeroo wal bira qabnu juxtaposition jenna.
So that is the word.
Jechichi juxtaposition jedhama.
So that is the act of bringing two things that were apart, you bring them together.
Waan adda addaa lama gaafa wal bira qabnu.
So that is what Ellen White has just done.
Isa kana Ellen White wanti seen.
She went to Revelation, which is at the end of the Bible,
Mul'ata xumura kitaaba qulqulluurra kan jiru kana fuute
and brought it together to Genesis, that is the start of the Bible.
uumama kitaaba wangeela keessaa kitaaba jalqabaa kan
So the act of bringing two things together, we call it just a position.
isaan kana lamaan gaafa wal bira qabnu tooftaa kan qajeelfama kana
So once you bring these two things together,
waan kana lamaan gaafa wal bira qabnu
what you can then begin doing is you start comparing and contrasting them.
achi booda waan kana wal bira qabne waliin madaalaa jechuudha.
For example, a comparison of the two things, of the two marker pens we have brought together,
Waan kana lamaan wal bira gaafa qabne waliin madaallu
is that four of them are pens.
lamaan isaaniiyyuu qopheedha yookaan qalama.
The contrast or difference will be, this will be a red marker pen and this will be a blue marker pen.
Kontraastiin yookaan waliin madaaluun kun inni tokko diimaadha inni tokko bifa samiiti.
So you bring two things together with an intent to compare and contrast them.
Waan kana lamaan wanni walitti fidnuu fi waliin madaaluudhaaf wal madaallee garaagarummaa isaa mul'isuuf.
Are we happy up to that point? So another thing that we can learn from what Ellen White has done
Waan biraa Ellen White wanti isheen hojjetterraa wanti nuyi barannu
is that if this is the gospel,
injoonni kun wangeela ta'ee
so if we compare that, Genesis 3:15 will also be the gospel.
mul'ata uumama boqonnaa 3:15 wajjin gaafa wal bira qabnu innis immoo wangeeladha.
But this will be the Alpha, the beginning.
Inni kun alfaadha yookaan isa jalqabaati.
This will be the Omega, the end.
Inni kun immoo omeegaadha yookaan isa xumuraadha.
So what Ellen White is basically telling us
Wanti Ellen White nutti himaa jirtu
is that God declares the end from the beginning.
Waaqayyo wanta xumura irratti ta'u jalqabarraatii mul'isa yookaan ibsa.
We'll add more flesh to that parable.
Fakkeenya kana yeroo caalchisnee yeroo itti daballee ibsinu
Genesis 3:15 will be the natural.
uumama boqonnaa 3:15 isa uumamaadha.
Revelation chapter 14 verse 16 will be the spiritual.
Mul'anni boqonnaa 14:6 immoo kana isa hafuuraadha.
So what we can then do
Wanti sana booda wanti nu gochuu dandeenyu
is go to the natural,
gara isa uumamaa dhannee
and the natural will help us understand the spiritual.
isa mul'ata isa hafuuraa immoo ittiin hubannaa.
Because Genesis 3:15 already happened,
uumama boqonnaa 3:15 wanta darbeedha.
we can go and study and understand it,
Isa dhannee qorannee hubannee
and that will help us to understand the spiritual, which is Revelation chapter 14 verse 6.
isa kana hafuuraa ittiin hubannaa jechuudha. Mul'ata boqonnaa 14:6.
So does that make sense up to that point?
Nu batamaa kun jiru.
So let's go to Genesis chapter 3 verse 15.
Uumama boqonnaa 3:15.
And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel.
Diinummaa isin gidduu nan ka'a nan dubbisa asumarra. Ani sii fi dubartittii gidduu sanyii isheetiif sanyii kee gidduutti diinummaa nan buusa. Inni mataa kee hin boruqsa, atis koomee isaa hin itti tajaajila.
So I want us to name the prayers as we did in Revelation chapter 14.
Sorry?
I want us to name the players in Genesis chapter 3, the parties in Genesis chapter 3 verse 15.
Uumama boqonnaa 3:15 kana keessa qooda fudhattoota jiranii akkasumas.
So before I do that, how many parties are we seeing? How many players are we seeing in 3:15 of Genesis?
Qooda fudhattoota meeqatu jira?
I don't need you to name them. I just need you to tell I'm seeing 3 for all 5 parties.
Lakkoofsa isaanii akkanatti hin ta'in barbaada malee abaloo akkasii jettan miti kan isaan. Is saying 3?
3, all right. Another?
Abraham?
2 parties, all right. Another? So 3 parties, let's try. It says, and I'll put in enmity. I. So who is the I?
God.
God. All right.
And in Jerusalem,
and then we have the woman. And then we have the serpent. The serpent. All right. And then we have her seed, the seed of the woman. We have another. And then we have his seed. So 5 parties, 5 players we see there. God, the woman, serpent, her seed, and his seed. So when the Bible says, I will, is that past, future, or present? So which tense is that? Future. All right? I will put an enmity. It's future. So let's try and define what this party represents as we did in Genesis in Revelation chapter 14. So we know the serpent represents Satan. The woman represents the church. So this will be the seed of the church, and that will be the seed of Satan. And the message in Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 is that God will plant an enmity between the seed of Satan and the seed of the woman, the church. So the everlasting gospel is about enmity between the church and Satan. So this is not about love, it's about enmity between the 2 classes. So what that tells us is that this everlasting gospel will always produce 2 classes of worshippers. And when we deal with them, when we speak about hatred, so if we go to the nature of man, right? Okay, let me do it better. I don't need the whole man. So let's assume that is the heart of man. So I know we have inside, we have the inner man that is being represented by the heart. And then we have the outer man, which is the body that we live in. So now we know, like, the inner man is not physical, it's not visible. It cannot be seen. But the outer man, this is the body in which we live in, is what we can see. So this is not Dr. Kedida, is the body in which Dr. Kedida lives in. This is the house in which Dr. Kedida lives in. Alright, so when we speak about the nature of man, it will always comprised of the higher powers and the lower powers.
Hiramu.
So when we speak about hatred,
Yeroo waa'ee jibbaa haasofnu
is it dealing with the higher powers or the lower powers?
waa'ee humnoota olaanoo moo waa'ee humnoota gadaanooti jibbi?
Hatred is dealing with the lower powers.
Waa'ee humnoota gadaanooti.
So another thing we can see with the everlasting gospel is that it's dealing with the nature of man.
Wangeelli bara baraa maaliitiin waa'ee maaliitii waa'ee uumama namaatiiti jechuudha.
So when we speak about the lower powers,
waa'ee humnoota gadaanoo gaafa haasofnu,
for example, if we have hatred, if I hate Dr. Kedida,
fakkeenyaaf yoo jibba qabaadhe Kedida yoo nan jibba ta'e,
what is the flip side of that?
Faallaan isaa maalidha? Garagalchiin isaa
Love.
jaalala.
The opposite of hatred is love.
Faallaan jibbaa jaalala.
So when we deal about love and hatred,
yeroo waa'ee jaalalaaf jibbaa haasofnu,
we start dealing about right and wrong.
waa'ee wanta sirrii ta'eef wanta sirrii hin taaneef.
Love is the right thing, hatred is the wrong thing.
Jaalalli waan sirrii ta'e yeroo ta'u, jibbi immoo waan sirrii hin taaneef.
So what deals, give me one word, what deals with the rightness or wrongness of something?
Waa'ee wanta sirrii ta'ee fi wanta sirrii hin taaneef jechi dubbatu, jechi isaan kana walitti qabu jecha maal jedhudha?
Morality.
Morality.
Jecha morality.
So therefore the gospel,
Wangeelli jira.
one, it deals with prophecy.
Wangeelli waa'ee raajitii tokko.
And the prophetic part of the gospel is demonstrating two classes of worshippers.
Aspektiin yookaan qaamni profeesii yookaan raajii kuni waa'ee waaqeffattoota gosa lamaaniiti.
But also the gospel
Akkasumas wangeelli
has to deal with morality.
moraalii wajjinis wal qabata.
And we see that right in the book of Genesis chapter 3 verse 15.
Isa kana uumama boqonnaa 3 lakkoofsa 15 keessatti isa argineedha.
So therefore, if we take the characteristics that we've learned in the natural, remember we said 3:15 is the natural, Revelation chapter 14 verse 6 is the spiritual.
Yaadadhaa uumamni 3:15 waa'ee isa uumamaa yeroo ta'u, mul'ata boqonnaa 10 lakkoofsa 6 ammoo isa hafuuraati.
Therefore, we can come and say one, Revelation chapter 14 verse 4 is the gospel that creates two classes of worshippers.
Kanaaf mul'ata boqonnaa 10 lakkoofsi 6 wangeela isa waaqeffattoota gosa lama yookaan
and this is because it creates enmity between the seed of the woman, the church, and the seed of the serpent, Satan.
Sababiinsa inni kuni diinummaa uumaa sanyii dubartittii fi yookaan waldaa fi sanyii bofichaa gidduutti.
But Revelation chapter 14 verse 6 also deals with its both prophetic and morals, prophecy and morality.
Akkasumas immoo mul'ata boqonnaa 10 lakkoofsi 6 waa'ee raajii waa'ee moraliitiis dubbata.
So if the gospel at the beginning of the world dealt with these two things, the gospel at the end of the world also has to deal with them.
Wangeelli jalqaba addunyaa kanaa waa'ee waan kanaa dubbate yoo ta'e, wangeelli xumura addunyaa kanaattis waa'ee waan kanaa dubbachuu qaba.
So another thing is that this is designed to plant hatred in the hearts of men.
Sana jechuun diinummaa garaa namootaa keessa kaa'u.
Alright, that is the work of the gospel.
Kun hojii wangeelaati.
So because I just want us to end, but one more thing before we end. So if we narrow down these, is that the gospel, one, it has two faces. What I'm doing will be the intellectual knowledge of the gospel. So the intellectual knowledge will be prophecy. But we all know the principle of cause and effect.
Qajeelfama waa'ee sababii fi bu'aa jedhus immoo beekna.
We see this more clear in Revelation chapter 10 and Ezekiel chapter 6.
Isa kana sirriitti kan nuyi irraa arginu mul'ata boqonnaa 10 fi Ezekiel boqonnaa 6 keessatti.
Ezekiel will take a book and eat it.
Ezekiel kitaaba fudhateeti nyaata.
When he eats the book,
yeroo kitaaba fudhatee nyaatu
the book is sweet to the mouth.
Afaan isaa keessatti mi'aawa.
But when it gets to the stomach,
garuu gaafa garaa keessa ga'u
the effect is that it becomes bitter.
Bu'aan isaa maalidha itti yaaddaa garaa keessatti.
So that is cause and effect.
Inni kun sababii fi bu'aadha.
So for every cause there must be an effect.
Sababii kamiifuu bu'aan jiraachuutu irra jira.
So the cause is prophecy of the gospel.
Ka'umsi yookaan sababiin raajiidha.
The effect is morality.
Bu'aan isaa immoo morality yookaan morality.
The cause, if we come to the end, will be equality. The intellectual knowledge about equality. Alright, let me put it. The form will be wearing pants.
Yeah.
Wearing pants, trousers.
Okay. Surree uffachuudhaaf fakkeenyaaf sababii.
The effect is how we treat them, how we treat the ladies.
Bu'aan isaa immoo akkamittiin dubartoota akka.
So the everlasting gospel has to do with both cause and effect, prophecy and morality.
Kanaaf wangeelli bara maal qaba sababii fi bu'aa qaba.
The intellectual knowledge is prophecy.
Beekumaa sun raajiidha.
But the spiritual knowledge is morality.
Inni kana hafuuraa sun immoo morality.
As far as we cannot police these, like we cannot have measurements of how you are supposed to behave.
Yo one thing sababu nkabanne, that means we don't have measurement for.
Yeah, for morality. You cannot measure morality.
Morality one thing sababu yo kabachu bande.
But the expectation is prophecy should make you to act right. The effect has to be your good behavior.
Rajin maal nama godha akkanwi amala gaarii godhannu yookaan akkaataa sirrii ta'een akka jiraannu godha.
The intellectual knowledge will be about equality and all the forms how you understand them.
Beekumsi waa'ee walqixxummaati yookaan akkaataatti walqixxummaa kana hubannu yeroo ta'u.
The effect will be how you treat them.
Bu'aan isaa immoo akkaataatti namoota qabnu.
So you understand that wearing pants is what prophecy requires of them.
Fakkeenyaaf surree uffachuun raajiin waan inni isaanirraa barbaadu yeroo ta'u.
But either if you are treating them in a sexist way, or if you still have misogynistic views.
I need explanation of those things.
All right. Let's use some simpler words. All right. I'll give you a simpler explanation.
Yeah.
How you treat them includes, do you still want to power and control them? Is that simpler?
Yeah. Dubartoota ammoo mallee gadi qabuu yookaan to'achuu barbaannaa isa jedhuufi.
So once you have the intellectual knowledge prophecy,
yoo beekuma qabaanne waa'ee raajii.
The morality part of it is that you must accept that they should hold the same power as yourself.
Inni morality aspectiin isaa yookaan garri morality isaa maalidha? Isaanis si wajjiniin walqixxee ta'uu isaanii fi akkuma keetti ilaaluu jalqabdaa jechuudha.
So for example, if the church has an elder, a man,
fakkeenyaaf waldaan yoo ildarii qabaatte yookaan jaarsa
what that means is also a woman can be an elder.
Dhiirri ildarii yoo ta'e gaafa moraalitiitti dhufnu beekumsi profeesiidhaan arganne kun dubartiinis ildarii ta'uu dandeessi jedhu.
So if at home you are the man is making financial decisions, for example,
mana keessatti waa'ee maallaqaa irratti murtee kan kennu yoo dhiira ta'e fakkeenyaaf,
that means they also have the same power. They can make financial decisions.
Dubartoonnis humnuma taataa qabu murtee maallaqaa irratti.
The reverse is also true.
Fal'aansaas immoo sirriidha.
For example, if they are the ones who are cooking,
Yoo dubartootatu busheessate nyaata.
It means as a man you can also cook.
Dhiirris busheessuu qabaa yookaan.
If for example they are the ones who are washing utensils,
yoo dubartoonni qodaa dhiqu ta'e,
the same should be true to a man.
Dhiironnis qodaa dhiquutu irra jira.
In fact, for us to achieve equality,
nuti walqixxummaa irra ga'uudhaaf,
you should cook more than they do. To flip the weighing scale.
Isaan caalaa bisheessuutu nurra jira jechuudha. Jechuun yeroo baay'ee dhiironni dubartoota caalaa bisheessuu qabu.
You see, this is a case of a weighing scale.
Madaalliin kan keenya kana fakkaata.
If this is weighing 90 kgs,
kiiloo 90 ta'e inni kuni,
and this is weighing 150 kgs,
kunimmoo kiiloo 150 yoo ta'e,
for it to balance, you will need to take some kgs and give this.
Kiiloo 150 sanarraa amma ta'e fudhatanii,
so the balance will come at 120. So that is the same principle. That means the gender roles that they are doing, no, you should do more than to flip the balance so that equality can be achieved. We call it equilibrium.
Equilibrium fiduudhaaf yookaan walqixxummaa sirriitti wal madaalii fiduudhaaf ba'aa isaan baatan yookaan hojii isaan hojjetan sana maal gochuudha caalaatti warri dhiirotaa fuudhanii hojjechuu qabu jechuudha.
So that is the message of the everlasting gospel. But as we understand, this is not a very good experience. It's a bitter experience.
Kun wangeela bara baraati shaakala mi'aa otoo hin taane shaakala hadhaadhaa.
But we've seen that is what the everlasting gospel is about.
Argina irraa kun wangeela bara baraa moo kanadha.
To Ezekiel, the book when he was eating it intellectual was sweet.
So to
the mouth it was a very good experience. But to the stomach is a very bitter experience. So the course is sweet because it's about them. It's just telling them, in fact, you just have to wear trousers.
But the
effect has to be bitter because now we have to leave the power and control and bring them to the balance.
Shaakalli bu'aansa garuu hadhaadha maaliifi to'annoo isa durii sana dhiisne isaaniin gara walqixxummaa.
So that is the everlasting gospel we see in Genesis chapter 3 verse 15.
Wangeelli bara baraan uumama boqonnaa 3:15
is the same everlasting gospel in Revelation chapter 14 verse 6. It has always been there. It's eternal.
Wangeela uumama boqonnaa mul'ata boqonnaa 14 keessa isa jiru wangeela bara baraa sana wajjin tokkuma yeroo hundumaa wangeela bara baraan.
So does that make sense? So we thank God it did. So we pray.
Kalani sifat Allah kita. Wangeelli bara baraa maal akka ta'e beekumsaan nutti agarsiifte. Beekumsi kun mi'aadha namatti tola. Shaakalatti gaafa dhufu garuu hadhaa akka ta'e argineerra. Jireenya keenya keessattis hadhaa akka ta'e shaakallee beekna. Hadhaa isa ta'e kana fudhachuu akka dandeenyu. Jireenya keenya keessatti shaakaluu akka dandeenyu. Madaallii wangeela bara baraa kana eeguu akka dandeenyu. Garatiin barbaadde dhufuu akka dandeenyu nu gargaara. Namoota wangeela bara baraa hubannaa duwwaadhaan hubatanii warra beekumaan afuufaman qofa akka hin taane beekumaan arganne kanaan jireenya keenya keessatti calaqqisee wangeela bara baraa jireenyi keenyas shaakalli keenyas agarsiisuu akka dandeenyuuf nu gargaari. Sagantaa amma yoonaatti nuuf kennite barsiisaa amma yoonaatti nu barsiifte hubannaa amma yoonaatti nuuf laatteef galanni siif haa ta'u. Yeroo keenya hafarrattis ulfaadhu ganamas deebinee haala wal fakkaataadhaan akka dhiyaannuuf ati nu gargaari. Danqaa kamitti humna amminaa hundumaa nurraa afuumi garaa keenyaaf jireenya keenya dhoksaa wangeela keetiin hubachuuf itti jiraachuu akka dandeenyuuf nu qopheessi maqaa gooftaa keenya Yesuusiin.